Windows Subsystem for Linux DevOps Story with Craig Loewen.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your humble host here on the Azure DevOps Podcast. And make sure to check out the website, www.azuredevops.show, for past episodes and show notes. And make sure to check out Amazon for my latest book. You can pre-order now, being published by A-Press, .NET DevOps for Azure. And you can get the preview edition in print form now if you want to go to directly to the book manufacturer, bit.ly/.NET DevOps book, and the ebook at bit.ly/.NET DevOps ebook. These channels will be taken down as soon as you can actually purchase it through A-Press, the official publisher. And there's also a special offer for user group or conference leaders, anyone speaking at those community events. And for those in-person events, I'd love to send 2 free physical copies of the book, of the preview edition, to give away and support those events. So to request those, go to bit.ly/.NET DevOps book for community. That's bit.ly/DOTNET DevOps book for community. And Microsoft Ignite is completely sold out, and it's going to be a hopping conference. I think it's topping over 20,000 attendees. It's going to be crazy. But I will be one of the official conference community reporters, and I'll be covering all the dev and the DevOps topics. And so make sure to check out, subscribe to me on Twitter at Jeffrey Palermo, and also check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jeffrey Palermo. And I'll have announcements leading up to the conference and then during the conference, hitting the high points. And you will be able to stream nearly all of the session content. So if you didn't make the cut, or if you're on the wait list, which by the way, there is a wait list, they expect to be opening up some more tickets. And so if you think, oh man, I just missed it, make sure to get on the wait list. But either way, you'll be able to learn all the information from the conference and stream all of that content live at the beginning of November. Another announcement, make sure to subscribe to my Twitter for the exact dates, but in late October, I'll be teaching another one of my training courses, .NET DevOps Bootcamp. And that date will be set for around late October. And so make sure to just check out my Twitter for announcements. Also, this is the first time that I'm announcing, and I haven't even put it on Twitter yet, but it probably will be by the time this episode airs, is I'll be organizing a party with Palermo the night before the Ignite conference, and it'll be 7 to 10 p.m. on that Sunday night before the Ignite conference at the Red Robin restaurant that's just down the street from the convention center in Orlando, Florida. And so if you're hearing this podcast, make sure to look on my Twitter for the announcement of where you can get your tickets. The tickets are free. We go through Eventbrite. And now let's get on to our topic. Craig Loewen is a program manager on the Windows Subsystem for Linux team, and he is with me today. Craig, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure, man! I'm so excited to get get into this topic because you live and breathe what it means to actually be able to run Linux commands on Windows, and that's a significant piece of software. But before we do, for those who might not be very familiar with you, how did you end up in this role? And what has your journey been there at Microsoft and before?
Yeah, so I started my role kind of getting into software through university. I studied as a Mechatronics Engineer. So that does sound like a transformer of some kind, but it actually means robotics. So I studied for robots. Nice. And I worked at a bunch of different places, and I really enjoyed software. So I ended up coming to Microsoft as an intern. And I worked on the Windows Subsystem for Linux and the Windows console. And I really, really liked it. And so I came back for full time. And then now I've been here for about a year as a full-time employee.
Awesome. Well, we've talked in so many different podcast episodes about some pretty significant software systems and different teams at Microsoft and elsewhere. And it's really interesting to be able to dive in and say, okay, this is a really, really important, really complex piece of software. How is this DevOps environment put together? How do we organize the code and do builds and static analysis, and what levels of testing is appropriate? What does it mean to version and deploy this thing? And how do we know how this thing is running in the hands of its users? We did a 2-part series on the founder and owner at RavenDB, Oren Einey, who it's a document database. It runs really well in Azure. And so that show was just the last couple of weeks, and the listeners can go on that one as well. But Craig, what if listeners have never even used the Windows Subsystem for Linux? Just give us a quick overview, why don't you?
Right. So the Windows Subsystem for Linux, we commonly shorten that down to WSL. So I'm probably going to say WSL a lot for the rest of this podcast. Okay. And just to save us some syllables. And what we're talking about when we're talking about WSL is it's a way for you to run your favorite Linux applications, tools, command line apps directly inside of Windows. So basically, you can take all of the Linux workflows that you're used to and run that on your Windows box without using a traditional VM experience or dual booting. So what it translates to is you can go to your start menu and there will be an Ubuntu app or a Debian app or an OpenSUSE app, and you can open that up and you'll have a bash prompt right away. And you can go in and run like apt update, apt install, download and install your favorite tools and start using them. And the really cool thing is you can also access your Windows executables. So you can run cmd.exe from bash if you wanted, which is quite cool. And you can access your Windows files. So you can go in and run, your bash scripts on your Windows files in your C drive, which is pretty unprecedented and a really, really cool application.
Nice. Okay, so first of all, why don't we start at the beginning? This has to be a massive code base. How is this stored? Is it in Git, or is it in Source Depot, or where is this code base organized?
So this is stored in Git. Actually, the Windows Subsystem for Linux is shipped with Windows. So we're tied to the Windows operating system, and basically all of our code lives inside of Windows.
Okay.
And so a lot of our DevOps operations is with the Windows DevOps operations.
Okay, so it's inside the Windows source code. So that is not on GitHub, not open source. But is that one massive Git repository or a series of repositories?
It's a series of repositories. There's one massive OS repository, and then we work on inside of that. And so we're actually labeled as an optional feature in Windows. So if you don't get the Windows Subsystem for Linux by default right away. You got to turn on and it'll basically decompress the bits inside of there to enable WSL on your computer.
Okay. And what languages are inside?
C. It's mostly written almost entirely in C.
Okay. Not C++, but just ANSI C?
Yeah, a lot of the times in C. I think there's some C++, but I would say entirely C.
Gotcha. And is that a Visual Studio solution with the Visual C++ SDK?
I believe so. I'd have to check with the developers for it on whether we use a Visual Studio solution through the SDK on it. Because there are some. The cool thing about the Windows Subsystem for Linux is also the terrifying thing about it is you use both Linux and Windows, right? And so it's hard to run everything directly in the same place because we have some Linux binaries that we ship as part of the Windows Subsystem for Linux. So there's not a single case where everything is wrapped up inside one gigantic solution.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's get to versioning. What does it mean to build WSL? What does that look like to change some code and actually produce a new versioned build that could be tried out by somebody?
Right. So we're tied to the Windows build and Windows versioning. So whenever we make changes to our code and commit, it's the exact same process as you would go through the Windows versioning process. So these basically these changes are made to our team's branch, and then those branches, like other teams are also working on their features. These branches are then at a very high level pulled together and tested over time, pulled together more and more through organizations until we reach the Windows that is released out to the public. And so whenever we make changes, they're basically pulled up through these different levels until they hit a public release.
Okay, so I'm imagining a very large build script that is building all of Windows, and that you guys have a section of it?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And what are some of the key meaningful things that you have to have in your part of that build?
So the things that we build are the WSL.exe is the entry point towards the Windows Subsystem for Linux. And so this controls how you interact and manage with your different distros inside of your subsystem. As well, we also build some different user services that connect to your service. We build some different user services that connect to the distros that you're running and function for things like interop, right? So if you are inside of WSL and you run cmd.exe, a user service runs that through the Windows Subsystem for Linux executable. It will run that executable for you. And so we build that. The other really interesting section that we build is we've just added a feature to allow users to access their Linux files from Windows. And so now we build a 9P protocol file server as well as part of this. And so we have a 9P protocol file server that lives inside of your Linux distributions that serves files back to Windows.
And when is that going to be released?
So that was it was released as a generally available release inside of the version 1903. I believe it's called the May update. So just this past 6 months ago. And then it also works inside of the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, which is the newest version that we have coming out.
Okay, we've got to pause and just say, what's version 2? You jump straight to version 2. What's the mind-blowing changes there?
Right. And so we had the Windows Subsystem for Linux 1, which we now call 1, which before we just called the Windows Subsystem for Linux.
Yeah.
And it basically worked under a translation architecture, right? So the actual, in the depths of what was happening when you ran a Linux binary is it would start the Linux binary, and anytime that binary had a system call, that system call would go to a core driver inside of the kernel, and that core driver translates it to a Windows NT system call. And so then we take any response back from the Windows NT system calls and we feed them back up to the actual Linux binary. So we were basically translating everything, which is really awesome. Like that's a really cool approach because we had a lot of versatility. We did not need virtualization at that point. Everything was running under the Windows NT kernel. And there was a lot of benefits to it. However, there's also a lot of challenges with it, like significant technical challenges. Windows and Linux don't work the exact same way, as I'm sure most people will tell you. And this can lead to some slowdowns or to some things just being very difficult to implement in a translation space. For example, if you have a file open inside of a folder in Windows and you try to rename the folder, it will say, hey, you have a file open, you can't do that.
Yeah.
But in Linux, if you try to do that, it will let you. And so if we're trying to program that system call, how can we do that when there's an obvious discrepancy between the two?
Yeah.
And so what we've done is we've shifted over to a virtualization based approach, but we've kept all the same user experience compared to WSL 1. So we've made a very lightweight virtual machine. We've put a real Linux kernel in it that's actually built by Microsoft and shipped with Windows.
Does that mean it's not Ubuntu now?
So it's Ubuntu user space or Debian user space,
okay.
But the actual kernel that we're running is based on the kernel from kernel.org. And so that's where when people say it's GNU Linux, not Linux.
Okay.
Before we were very much the GNU part, and now we actually have GNU Linux where we're shipping a Linux kernel as part of WSL.
Okay, so now there's actual virtual machine going to be running. Now that would, does that open them some additional capabilities that were not there previously?
Yes. Oh, yes. Because we have a full Linux kernel, there are some system calls I said that were really hard to implement, and things like Docker used a lot of these new system calls. And so now in the new WSL2, you can actually run applications like Docker. You can run basically any Linux application because it has full system call compatibility. Or in WSL1, there were still areas that we were trying to improve.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
Okay, so is it an overstatement now to say that when this comes out, that if you're running Windows 10, well, you're running Windows and Linux. You just have them both, and they're both there, and you're running both.
I would agree. Yes,
Sweet.
there's an asterisk to that, just to dot my I's and cross my T's. Is that Linux has a really huge amount of things that you can do with it, and so there's things that we're trying to improve. Obviously, GPU related workloads for machine learning is an area that's super highly requested, that we're investigating on how we can make that possible. Device pass-through, people want to be able to program things like Arduinos, and that's possible in WSL1, and we're working on improving that in WSL2. So there's still like an asterisk to that sentence, but yes, you're running actual Linux. You just have to keep in mind that it is in a virtualized context.
Nice. No, I'm really excited. You mentioned Arduino. I've got a little Adafruit Arduino box right here. I just bought for my kids. It's the Circuit Playground Express education kit with all the sensors and lights for some digital jewelry and
wow. So that's awesome. Yeah.
And it comes in a nice little metal tin lunchbox type box. So wow. The Make Code program seems to make it really easy. I've got 3 kids who they want to learn to code. I mean, they're doing all kinds of stuff, but I'm trying to figure out, what else can we do?
Right. And that's where, in my opinion, I think the Windows Subsystem Linux is great for that, because sometimes it can be onerous to, port your whole machine over to using a Linux instance, right? Like dual booting is terrible, frankly. And whenever I run Linux, I'm like, I just want only Linux on this machine. And that can be definitely a big step for some people to take, especially if they're like, I've used Windows my whole life. Like, what's but maybe I'll do it. It's intense, right? It's a big buy-in. And so WSL is an awesome way for you to say, hey, let's spin up just a Linux instance, right, in Windows, and I can start using stuff right away.
That's awesome. All right, so let's get back to DevOps. So we're building this thing as part of Windows. What is your build server?
So we actually use the Windows setup for it, and so I might not be a total subject matter expert on the build server, but we're basically deployed through DevOps. So we're building remotely through it.
So it is now running through the Azure DevOps Services product.
Right, I believe so.
Okay, that's huge. I mean, I know that the TFS, Azure DevOps Services, last September, and launching as a cloud service. I mean, the Windows. It's a huge monumental shift to get that onto the product. No doubt you have really, really custom agents. So that's awesome. How often, so you're checking in code, your team is checking in code. How does it automatically trigger every time, or how often is it running this massive build?
So we have builds that run once a day on the lower branches. And then over time, it can vary from team to team, and there's a bunch of mitigating factors on when we basically reverse integrate these builds up through the different organizations. But we run once a day each build with all the changes, and that's what the build that I use on my actual work computer, just to make sure that I'm running the latest changes, and then that gets reverse integrated backed up through basically the tree.
Okay. So you mentioned the build that runs on your computer. So what goes in? That's your private build script or routine. What goes into that?
Yeah, so that's basically any changes that are made on inside of DevOps or inside of the Git repository for the Windows Subsystem for Linux. That's built on our branch, and so any changes are just focused at WSL changes. And so I use that on my machine so that anytime that there's code checked in, I can run tests on it and verify it. And then over time, those builds get reverse integrated back up. And once they are fully to the master branch, so they're basically have been tested enough, they're forward integrated back down. And so we get the changes from the other teams inside of Windows.
Okay. And is that a PowerShell script, or what does that entail when you say run it on my box?
Right. So when I run it on my box, all I need to do is actually go to Windows settings, and you can do pick your own branch. And so I pick my own branch, and then I choose the one internally from there. So I don't even go through PowerShell. I use GUI.
Gotcha. All right. So let's talk about testing. You must have some significant automated testing for the subsystem. Right.
So Windows already has tons of testing in terms of blue screens of death or BSODs and everything like that. But when we actually run WSL, we do testing for it. The challenge with WSL is it's such a wide use case of what we're running. You can run so many things inside of it, and so frequently we test inside of the Windows Subsystem for Linux 1, which we actually implemented the system calls. We had a test harness in place that would test those system calls to make sure they still worked. Inside of the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, we test that everything compiles and loads correctly. But in terms of actually, I want to test that this workflow works on it, a lot of that is done by our amazing users inside of the Windows Insider program. And internally users who are actually using the product and reporting issues. And so that's really well integrated with DevOps in a lot of ways, because we go on GitHub and we say, hey, if you're experiencing an issue with the Windows Subsystem for Linux, post this issue on GitHub and we'll track it there. And then we take those issues and we put them into DevOps. And so that's how we track all of our issues inside WSL and how we can fix them. And we've also integrated feedback there. So you can use the Windows Feedback Hub to collect some diagnostic data, and that gets sent up, and we can triage that through Azure DevOps as well.
Okay, so the external issues, anybody can add an issue on GitHub because that's a public project there.
Yep.
When you say then we pull them into Azure DevOps, is that a manual process or is that an automated integration?
So that you can use both tools for it. There are tools to manually link issues between GitHub and DevOps. And then a lot of the time, I like to manually pull stuff over and take a look so that I can organize it for the next sprint or development cycle.
Right. Man, if anybody's out there listening, that would be a fantastic integration to have. I think a lot of people would love their broad customer base to have just a suggestion box. And if that could automatically be pulled in as a custom work item type called, suggestion, that right. would be, if any of you marketplace developers are listening out there. All right, so we've got the build, you're embedded with Windows and you have a new version. So deploying, I'm guessing, is tied into the Windows release cycle as well. How do you get information and telemetry and logs about how it's going out there in the wild?
Right. And so I think a lot of it's just kind of similar to the other answers that I've had before. A lot of this is tied to the Windows logging system. So Windows has an amazing telemetry service, and we call into those APIs to gather any WSL diagnostic data of, hey, this crash happened.
But you have to push. Your developers have to actually write information into that system, right?
Right, that's correct. So we call, basically, there are APIs inside of the Windows telemetry, like that, into that framework that we can call into and say, hey, we want to log this specific data. And then that's pulled through the Windows telemetry service.
Okay. Do you have any idea about how many people are actively using WSL out there in the wild?
Yeah. So we actually talked about this at last build, and there are about 3 million monthly active users using WSL. So quite a number.
That sounds a lot. Of course, I don't know the number of monthly Windows active users.
Right. I'm sure that's much higher. But monthly active devices, I believe I said users. Monthly active devices, 3 million monthly active devices.
Gotcha. Okay. Very cool. And man, you kind of popped a can of worms open in my brain with WSL2 and just going completely VM based, meaning you mentioned Docker. Instead of having to have the VirtualBox installation to run Docker on Windows, now we just run containers kind of natively in Windows in WSL2.
Yeah, and so Docker is actually super excited about the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2. They've released a technical preview that uses WSL2 as their backend architecture. So if you've ever used Docker for desktop in Windows, it makes a Moby Linux VM on your computer, and it connects that VM with Linux to make Docker containers to basically facilitate that experience. And so there were some challenges with the Moby Linux VM, like its startup time is a big one. As well as some resource management and file system permissions. And the great thing about using the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2 is their backend is the startup time went from about 45 seconds to 1 second in the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2. Yeah, which is awesome.
Wait a minute, you're saying 1 second to start up a VM?
Yes, that's the experience in WSL2. So if when you go and run, you say, I want bash, you wait 1 second, and then it will pop up. And we actually did a lot of this by having a Linux kernel that we load directly into memory. We skip the bootloading phase. And so it's a really hyperly fast VM that we've worked with. It was originally developed for Azure workloads.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being used in things like a Windows sandbox. And we use that technology inside of the Windows Subsystem for Linux as well.
Now, I'm guessing this is going to affect Windows Server as well. Right. Or is that going to be a client-only thing?
No, it's available in Windows Server as well, and also available in Windows 10 Home. And we have a optional component called the Virtual Machine Platform optional component, and that enables basically the Hyper-V features. So we use the Hyper-V architecture behind this. And so even though the Hyper-V feature is not available in Windows 10 Home, the Virtual Machine Platform feature is, and that's what we're dependent on.
Okay. All right. So if WSL2 is going to go to Windows Server, just like all the rest of it, does that mean that in Azure, when I spin up a Windows Server, then I can, if I want to put multiple applications on a particular VM, low volume applications, some of them want to target Linux and some of them want to target Windows. It just doesn't matter because now both kernels are native.
Yes, yes, with an asterisk again. So to explain, the Windows Subsystem for Linux 1 is available on Azure VMs. So you can run it in Windows Server and use that now or right away. And then when Windows Subsystem for Linux 2 is generally available, yes, you'll be able to do that. The only caveat is you need to enable nested virtualization inside of that.
That's easy.
Yeah, all V3 VMs inside of Azure are able to do that. But you need to make sure that's enabled, and then you're able to run WSL2 inside of that.
And I'm even thinking people who can't get some infrastructure into Azure yet, and so they have, of course, VMs in a data center somewhere, but they're wanting to use Docker containers, and everybody, forget high scale, everybody has plenty of applications that are super low scale. And so for them, it's okay, I don't need to dedicate my own specific servers. Can't I just install multiple on a given VM? That happens all the time. And so especially for containerizing things, if now I have a Windows server that can run Docker super easy, well, if I upgrade something, containerize it, get it there, and once it's containerized, then when the organization is ready for Azure, that's a super easy migration up to Azure Container Instance or any of the services up there that can run those containers. That's a great bridge.
I agree.
It's a great bridge. Now, what about UI? It's for WSL2. What are your plans for the UI for that version?
So the in the Windows Subsystem for Linux 1, we don't really support GUI apps.
Right.
We don't officially support them. However, you can still use them. So you can go and get an X server. There's some available in the Microsoft Store, as well as you can just download some free ones online that are open source. And once you have that running, you connect it to your WSL instance, and you can run some GUI apps like XEyes or the XFCE4 desktop, stuff like that. And in WSL 1, because we didn't really prioritize some of these apps, some of those system calls are still, there's still some gaps that we need to fill. But in WSL 2, we have a full Linux kernel with full system call compatibility. So things tend to work much, much, much better. So I'm able to run a full XFCE4 desktop through WSL 2, through an X server, if I wanted to. And overall, we are looking at ways that we can improve this experience. We think adding GUI apps would be really interesting. In general, in the past, we've targeted just command line apps because as a developer, we hope you spend most of your time directly in the command line. But we're definitely interested in adding GUI apps to WSL.
Awesome. Okay, and so if our listeners who are listening to this, their minds are blowing and their thoughts are racing, if they want to learn more now, what resources would you point them to?
Yeah, so the best place to learn about everything WSL, there's a link, aka.ms/WSL docs. And that will give you all the information you need to know about setting it up on your computer, what it is, what it does, and some common frequently asked questions. And if you want to keep really up to date with all of the latest news of everything command line in Windows, I would check out the link, aka.ms/CLI blog. That's our command line blog, and we frequently post there about anything WSL related, so you'll get all the latest news. And if you want to personally reach out to people on the team, you can reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at Craig A. Loewen, so CraigALoewen. And you can ask me any WSL questions there if they're not anywhere else in the blog or in the documentation.
Awesome. Fantastic. I know plenty of our listeners will be going and checking out those resources. Well, man, this is fascinating. Thanks, Craig, for sharing this and spending this time with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.